The Mediterranean shimmered under the midday sun, blue, calm, and deceptively peaceful. High above the waters of the Gulf of Sidra, 2 U.S. Navy F-14 Tomcats from VF-41, the Black Aces, cruised at 24,000 feet. They weren't hunting. They were patrolling. Their AWG-9 radar systems scanned the horizon with the patience of sentinels. Below, 2 fast-moving blips broke into view. Libyan MiG-23 floggers. Launched from bases near Benghazi, they climbed fast, flying hot and straight toward the Tomcats. This wasn't the first time Libyan pilots had tested the Americans. In 1981, MiG-23s had attempted a similar intercept and failed. But this time, they came faster, bolder, as if they believed something had changed. In truth, nothing had. The MiG-23s, despite their reputation in Soviet doctrine as formidable interceptors, were undertrained and outmatched. Their radar systems lacked resolution. Their R-23 missiles couldn't lock at long range, and their pilots were relying on one thing only: speed. The F-14s had something else: awareness. In the cockpit of the lead Tomcat, the radar intercept officer calmly tracked the incoming fighters. He didn't need a visual. The AWG-9 had painted the MiGs at 60 miles. The pilots had already discussed the intercept strategy, memorized it, and drilled it hundreds of times at Top Gun. The MiGs closed to within 30 miles. One maneuvered erratically. The other attempted to flank. Too late. The F-14 banked hard and dove. The Sidewinder IR missile locked instantly. One button press, one scream, one kill. The second MiG tried to pull away. The Tomcat rolled, turned inside, and launched another missile. The second Libyan jet exploded in midair, no chance to eject. The entire engagement took 90 seconds. Back in the command room in Tripoli, Libyan officers were stunned. These MiG-23s were supposed to match Western airframes. They were fast, nimble, armed. But they hadn't landed a shot. They hadn't even seen the Tomcats coming until it was too late. Thousands of miles away, in a Soviet intelligence cell near Moscow, GRU analysts reviewed the black box data. The result was inescapable. The F-14 had detected, tracked, engaged, and destroyed MiG-23s before a single Soviet missile could lock. What had been sold to Soviet air doctrine as a simple interceptor had just performed like a guided missile cruiser with wings. The F-14 wasn't designed for fair fights. It was designed to make sure the fight was over before the other side even knew it began. And for every Soviet pilot who had once mocked the Tomcat as an overbuilt carrier relic, this was their wake-up call. Behind the reinforced concrete walls of a classified Soviet air doctrine planning facility outside Moscow, a belief took root in the late 1970s. A belief that the new American F-14 Tomcat, with its sweeping wings and monstrous size, was a bloated, fragile machine. Impressive on paper, yes, but in a dogfight? Vulnerable, overcomplicated, unsustainable. To Soviet planners, the Tomcat looked like an interceptor pretending to be a fighter, a twin-engine behemoth built for carriers, not combat. And so, the MiG-23 became their answer: lighter, faster, and simpler. A swing-wing platform that could take off from short runways, reach Mach 2.3, and deliver missiles in a quick, hard strike. It was agile at high speeds, brutal in straight-line attacks, and easier to mass-produce than the F-14 would ever be. This logic shaped Soviet export policy. They armed allies like Iraq, Libya, and Syria with MiG-23s by the dozens. They warned their pilots, "The Tomcat is large. It cannot turn fast. Engage from distance. If it tries to close in, disengage and run." What they didn't realize was that this doctrine played right into American hands. While the Soviets measured performance in speed and ceiling, the U.S. Navy had already moved on. The F-14 wasn't built for tight-turning dogfights. It was built for beyond visual range kills. Its radar, the AWG-9, had no equivalent in the Soviet arsenal. It could scan 100 miles ahead and lock multiple targets before the MiG-23's primitive sensors even picked up a return. And then came the Phoenix. The AIM-54A wasn't a missile. It was a statement. Capable of Mach 5 speeds and a range of 100-plus miles, it was designed to destroy bombers before they reached the carrier group. But when repurposed against enemy fighters like the MiG-23, it became an executioner. Soviet doctrine never accounted for that range. Their training simulations assumed combat would begin at 20 kilometers or less. They never envisioned a scenario where their jets would be dead before even spotting the enemy. And worse, MiG-23s relied heavily on ground-controlled intercept (GCI) radars to guide them. Without that data, they were blind. The F-14 needed none of that. Its onboard radar was autonomous. Its two-man crew, pilot and RIO, could hunt, track, and kill independently. But back in Moscow, these advantages were dismissed as Western over-engineering. The thinking went, "They build expensive toys, we build real weapons." And yet, time and time again, those toys were outperforming MiG-23s in every engagement, from the skies over the Persian Gulf to training exercises in NATO airspace. Soviet pilots were taught that turning radius, climb rate, and thrust-to-weight ratios would win the next air war. But the F-14 proved something very different. The first shot wins, and the MiG-23 never got one. For decades, the Soviet air combat doctrine revolved around one core principle: speed plus numbers equals air superiority. Their vision of the next war didn't involve long-range radar duels or stealthy kills from beyond the horizon. It was a clash of masses, where fast interceptors and ground controllers would overwhelm Western pilots before they could respond. This thinking birthed the MiG-23, a fighter with variable geometry wings designed to climb fast, hit hard, and get out. It was not a dogfighter. It was a hit-and-run assassin, provided the enemy was cooperative. But doctrine had lagged behind reality. Soviet air battles were imagined in the Fulda Gap, low altitude, radar-jammed, short-range slugfests. Pilots were trained to react to GCI commands, lock onto targets at medium distance, fire a pair of missiles, and return to base. They were dependent, not autonomous. In contrast, the U.S. Navy had evolved into something radically different. Top Gun wasn't just a school, it was a revolution. Its graduates flew the F-14 not as brute force machines, but as tactical hunters, fighters who made their own decisions in real time, often beyond communication range. This shift in culture reshaped the F-14's role. No longer just a fleet defender, it became a long-range execution platform. Where Soviet doctrine expected missile duels at 15 kilometers, the F-14 could track and fire at 150 kilometers. And while the MiG-23 needed to see to fire, the F-14 could kill based on radar returns alone. By the early 1980s, the cracks in Soviet doctrine were showing. In conflicts like the Iran-Iraq War, F-14s in Iranian service used their AWG-9 radars and AIM-54s to destroy MiG-23s before they even crossed into Iranian airspace. Pilots reported being shot down by ghosts they never visually detected. Soviet advisors called the reports exaggerated, until they weren't. Meanwhile, U.S. Navy Tomcats flew near Libya, escorting reconnaissance missions and baiting Soviet-supplied jets into range. Time and again, MiG-23s would respond to radar contacts and suddenly disappear from Libyan tracking, wiped out mid-air by sidewinders or sparrows before they could maneuver. And yet, Soviet doctrine persisted. Because admitting the truth meant more than acknowledging technological inferiority. It meant admitting that the foundation of their fighter strategy, control from the ground, massed speed, and close-in kills, was already dead. The F-14 wasn't playing the same game. It had changed the rules. Where the MiG-23 needed vectors from a command bunker, the F-14 needed only one radar return. Where Soviet pilots asked for permission to engage, F-14 crews were trained to fire independently, and where Soviet doctrine assumed visual range was where the battle began. The F-14 had already ended it. It happened on a moonless night in January 1981. South of the oil-rich port city of Abadan, 2 Iranian F-14 Tomcats cruised silently at 30,000 feet. The Iran-Iraq War was entering its bloodiest phase, and Iraqi MiG-23s had grown bold, crossing into Iranian airspace with increasing frequency. But tonight, they were being hunted. Inside the cockpit of the lead F-14, the radar intercept officer picked up something strange. 4 radar returns, fast-moving, approaching from 100 nautical miles out. Iraqi MiG-23s, closing fast. The Tomcats didn't climb. They didn't break formation. They simply adjusted their targeting computers. The AWG-9 radar swept outward, locking onto all 4 targets. The Rio flicked the weapons system selector to Phoenix, AIM-54A missiles, each 6 times heavier than a Sidewinder and capable of Mach 5, slid into position. Then came the impossible. 2 Phoenix missiles launched, at targets 80 miles away. A third followed 10 seconds later, then a fourth. The missiles didn't scream. They vanished. Accelerating to 5 times the speed of sound, they climbed to near-space altitude, then plunged down on their targets like orbital death from above. Less than a minute later, the AWG-9 tracked 3 explosions. No visual contact was ever made. The Iraqi MiG-23s never had a chance to maneuver. They simply disappeared. This wasn't combat, as the Soviets understood it. This wasn't a duel. It was execution by radar. When the mission report was reviewed by Iranian commanders, disbelief gave way to awe. The Phoenix had performed exactly as advertised, confirming a capability the West had theorized but never truly tested in combat. Back in Baghdad, the Iraqi Air Force was stunned. Their MiG-23s had never even seen the enemy. They'd received no warning, no radar locks, no chance to escape. And when Soviet advisors reviewed the engagement data, the implications were horrifying. 4 high-speed fighters with electronic countermeasures, radar-guided missiles, and ground support obliterated before they even crossed the FIBA. A weapon system that could track and destroy targets 100 miles away. independently, mid-air? That wasn't a fighter. That was a revolution. Yet even then, the Soviet response was to deny, to deflect. They accused the Iranians of fabrication. They blamed faulty Iraqi tactics. They called it improbable. But within weeks, Iraqi MiG-23 flights were halved. Within months, they began flying only at low altitude, hugging terrain to evade radar. They had learned the lesson Moscow refused to admit. The F-14 wasn't just another American toy. It was a predator. And the Phoenix was real. And the MiG-23? It had been vaporized by a system it couldn't even detect. The reports arrived in thick manila folders stamped in red. From Iraqi Air Force Command, confidential. Inside were the details of multiple engagements, combat logs, radar readouts, pilot testimonies. Time after time, Iraqi MiG-23s were failing to return from missions over Iranian airspace. No dogfights, no distress calls, just sudden disappearance. The kill reports made an astonishing claim. F-14s were shooting down MiG-23s from ranges exceeding 80 miles, often before visual contact, and always without Iraqi radar acquiring return pings. To Soviet intelligence analysts, it sounded like fiction. In their view, the AIM-54 Phoenix was theoretical, too expensive, too large. A missile built for shooting down high-flying bombers, not agile fighters like the MiG-23. They believed it was just another case of U.S. over-design, impressive on paper, but ineffective under combat stress. So they dismissed the Iranian claims. They called the radar kill logs manipulated. They chalked up the MiG-23 losses to pilot error, maintenance issues, or ambushes from U.S. pilots disguised as Iranians. And yet, the numbers kept rising. By late 1982, the Iranian Air Force reported over 30 confirmed MiG-23 kills by F-14s, the majority at beyond visual range. In one encounter, a single Tomcat allegedly fired 3 Phoenix missiles and destroyed 3 MiGs in under 90 seconds. Still, Moscow insisted it wasn't possible. Their faith in the MiG-23 remained rooted in dogma. It was faster than the F-14. It could climb faster. It had a smaller radar cross-section. And in the Soviet mind, quantity and acceleration still beat electronics. But beneath the bravado, concern was growing. The GRU began comparing radar frequencies from AWG-9 test emissions gathered near Japan and the North Atlantic. They found terrifying results. The American system could maintain lock on 6 separate targets at once, even with moderate jamming. This wasn't a radar. It was a hunter's brain. Meanwhile, Soviet test pilots were quietly flown to Libya to debrief MiG-23 squadrons after close calls with U.S. Navy F-14s in the Mediterranean. The stories they returned with were chilling. We never saw them. They were already behind us. They fired before our systems even lit up. But the official line from Moscow didn't change. The MiG-23 was still exported. The F-14 was still mocked in doctrine papers. And the Phoenix? Too unreliable for combat use. Because to accept the truth would mean acknowledging something far worse than technological inferiority. It would mean admitting that Soviet doctrine had created a fighter designed for the last war, and America had built the one for the next. The denial couldn't last forever, because the losses were piling up. And soon, the MiG-23 would start falling in public. Not in secret dogfights, not in distant proxy wars, but on global television, with cameras rolling, and the whole world watching. Soviet engineers built the MiG-23 on one seductive equation: speed equals victory. It could hit Mach 2.3. It had swing wings to optimize both takeoff and supersonic cruise. It could climb to 60,000 feet in under 3 minutes. On paper, it outclassed nearly every Western fighter in raw acceleration and speed. To Soviet commanders, that was enough. Because in their doctrine, a faster jet could always escape, reposition, or outrun a missile. The goal wasn't prolonged engagement, it was a fast kill or a fast exit. But air combat was changing. By the late 1970s, speed was no longer the ultimate weapon, it was situational awareness. And the F-14 Tomcat wasn't built to outrun you. It was built to find you first, and fire before you ever saw it. The MiG-23's speed was real, but it came with crippling trade-offs. Its radar system, the Sapphire-23, had narrow field of view and poor look-down, shoot-down capability. Its maneuverability at subsonic speeds was weak, and it bled energy rapidly in turns, making it almost useless in a close-in dogfight. Even at high speed, the MiG-23's agility was constrained by structural limits. Its pilots were told not to exceed 5.5 Gs in many maneuvers or risk frame damage. Meanwhile, the F-14, larger, heavier, slower, could pull 6.5 plus Gs safely, and with its twin tails and powerful engines, could turn inside a MiG-23 in most combat regimes. Then came the real revelation. Speed without targeting means nothing. In multiple encounters, both Iranian and American F-14 pilots reported MiG-23s attempting fast passes, banking hard, and then accelerating away, hoping to avoid missile locks. But the AWG-9 radar didn't care about speed. It tracked based on signature and direction, and the AIM-54 Phoenix could hit targets traveling Mach 3. Faster enemy? No problem. Just a better target. U.S. Navy pilots learned to let the MiG-23 come to them. They baited them into range, then launched Phoenix missiles or turned into them for close-range Sparrow or Sidewinder kills. One Top Gun instructor summarized it bluntly. The MiG-23 is like a sprinter in a knife fight. He'll lunge once, and then he's winded. Soviet analysts clung to speed as their ace in the hole, failing to grasp that the entire nature of air combat had changed. The first visual didn't win the fight anymore. The first radar lock did. The MiG-23 had been built for an era where fighters saw their enemies with their eyes. The F-14 had been built for an era where fighters saw their enemies with sensors, and no amount of speed could escape a missile you never knew was coming. There was another dogma embedded deep within Soviet air doctrine. Missiles win fights, not pilots. The MiG-23 was designed to be a platform, a missile truck, fast, cheap, replaceable. Its systems were automated to the point of limitation. Pilots were trained to follow GCI commands, fire at radar targets, and then disengage. Independent thinking wasn't part of the job. This worked in Soviet war games, but in real combat, it was a death sentence, because the F-14 wasn't just a superior aircraft, it was flown by the most dangerous pilot cadre on Earth. Top Gun wasn't an elite school, it was a crucible. Born from the ashes of Vietnam's early air combat failures, Top Gun revolutionized air warfare by shifting focus from aircraft specs to pilot psychology, tactics, and autonomous decision-making. Tomcat pilots were trained to think beyond the flight manual, to manipulate the enemy's speed, altitude, and angles, to bait, to ambush, to hunt. Each one of them had fought hundreds of simulated fights before ever launching live missiles. MiG-23 pilots? Most had never seen a live missile fired before combat. In Iraq, Libya, and Syria, Soviet-trained MiG pilots followed rigid engagement protocols. Track the target. Call ground control. Wait for command. Fire. But F-14 crews didn't wait. They saw. They fired. They killed. All within the first 10 seconds of contact. And when a missile missed, Tomcat pilots closed in with sidewinders and guns, executing split S-dives, high yo-yo maneuvers, and barrel rolls the MiG-23 simply couldn't match. The problem wasn't just technology. It was philosophy. Soviet doctrine believed automation would cover for pilot shortcomings. But in reality, missiles missed. Radars glitched. And when that happened, the Tomcat pilot adapted. The MiG-23 pilot hesitated. In a dozen recorded engagements, MiG-23s fired first and still lost. Why? Because the missiles were launched out of range, because they weren't tracking independently, because the pilots weren't empowered to improvise. U.S. pilots weren't just trained to fire missiles, they were trained to create the shot, to force the enemy into a losing position before ever squeezing the trigger. One former F-14 Rio put it like this: the MiG-23 was a machine with a missile. We were hunters with wings. The Cold War proved one brutal fact. The best missile in the world means nothing in the hands of a poorly trained pilot. And the MiG-23, for all its speed and sensors, was only ever as good as the man behind the stick. The F-14 didn't just win because of better weapons. It won because of better warriors. For years, the KGB and GRU collected terabytes of signals intelligence on the F-14 Tomcat. Intercepts, radar sweeps, even photographs from satellites and trawlers shadowing U.S. carrier groups. And yet, they missed the most important thing. The F-14 wasn't just a fighter. It was a force multiplier in motion. Soviet analysts focused on the wrong metrics. They compared the MiG-23's climb rate to the F-14's. They noted the Tomcat's weight and size, its maintenance needs, and limited range when carrying full fuel. What they didn't understand, or didn't believe, was that the F-14's systems were integrated in a way no Soviet fighter had ever attempted. Their biggest blind spot? The AWG-9 radar and the AIM-54 Phoenix missile. The GRU dismissed Phoenix test footage as exaggerated. In internal briefings, they claimed the missile was practically useless against maneuvering fighters. They believed its massive size and high-altitude arc made it easy to spoof with ECM or flares. But they were wrong. The AWG-9 didn't just fire and forget. It tracked and guided the Phoenix all the way to terminal stage. And unlike Soviet radar systems, which could only guide 1 or 2 missiles at a time, the AWG-9 could track 24 targets and simultaneously engage 6. This created a tactical nightmare for the Soviets. One Tomcat could hold off an entire squadron. Not with raw firepower, but with uncertainty. Because once a MiG-23 pilot knew he was being tracked by an F-14, he had no idea if the Phoenix had already been launched. At Mach 5, and with a 160-mile range, a Phoenix could already be in the air, unseen, undetected, unavoidable. And Soviet aircraft had no counter. Their jammers were outdated. Their flares were ineffective at high altitude, and their radar warning receivers couldn't identify Phoenix launches at long range. Worse still, the MiG-23's own radar lacked look-down, shoot-down capability. If an F-14 flew low over water or terrain, the MiG often lost the lock completely. In real combat, that meant death. But perhaps the greatest intelligence failure was cultural. Soviet doctrine emphasized ground-based control. Even the best MiG-23 pilot was only as effective as his GCI officer. The F-14, by contrast, was built for autonomous warfare. Its two-man crew, pilot and RIO, operated like a self-contained strike command center. They didn't need permission. They didn't need vectors. They made decisions in seconds and killed in half that time. Soviet intelligence missed the shift. They prepared for a duel. The F-14 came for an ambush. By the time Soviet planners realized the truth, it was too late. Their MiG-23s had already been falling from the skies over Libya, over Iraq, over the Gulf, and no amount of propaganda could hide the mounting wreckage. The intelligence said the F-14 was flawed. Reality proved it was untouchable. It wasn't just the F-14 that crushed the MiG-23. It was everything behind it. Because the Tomcat was never meant to fight alone. It was born from a doctrine that fused hardware, software, and human skill into a seamless warfighting machine. What the Soviets saw as just a fighter was, in truth, the tip of a very long spear. At its core was the AWG-9 radar, capable of scanning 100 nautical miles, tracking 24 targets, and locking onto 6 simultaneously. This wasn't just range, it was situational dominance. But the real advantage came when the F-14 linked with the larger American system. High above the battlefield flew the E-2 Hawkeye, an airborne early warning and control platform. It provided real-time targeting data to F-14 squadrons, extending their radar eyes by hundreds of miles. On the sea, Aegis cruisers tracked aircraft, missiles, and ships, feeding targeting data to every aircraft in the carrier battle group. And on the carriers themselves, coordination centers fused information from satellites, sonar, radar, and human intelligence into a single, real-time tactical picture. The F-14 wasn't flying solo, it was operating inside a networked kill web. And the MiG-23? It was operating blind. Soviet GCI systems were ground-based, analog, slow. They fed pilots limited information, bearing, range, altitude, often delayed by seconds. And if a MiG lost contact with ground radar, it lost the fight. Meanwhile, the F-14 could operate independently for hours, identify targets on its own, and, critically, choose when and where to engage. U.S. Navy doctrine trained F-14 squadrons to hunt. They flew in pairs, with layered support, executing multi-axis engagements that left enemy pilots confused, disoriented, and vulnerable. Top Gun instructors embedded in each squadron taught not just how to fly, but how to outthink. Simulated combat drills ran 24/7 aboard carriers. Debriefs were brutal. Mistakes were dissected. Weaknesses erased. By 1985, U.S. Navy F-14s had conducted over 10,000 intercepts without losing a single aircraft in combat. This wasn't by chance. It was by design. The MiG-23 was built to fly fast and fire fast, but the F-14 was built to win the war before the dogfight began. And then there was the weapon that made the difference, the AIM-54 Phoenix. At 13 feet long and weighing over 1,000 pounds, it could climb to 100,000 feet, lock onto a target traveling 3 times the speed of sound, and strike from over 160 miles away. It wasn't a missile. It was a surgical airstrike in a canister. MiG-23 pilots, often unaware they were being tracked, would suddenly explode in midair before any warning receiver lit up. Those who survived described the sensation as surreal. "1 second I'm flying," one Libyan pilot recalled. "The next, I see fire in the sky. The radio goes silent." The Soviet model assumed air combat began when radars lit up and missiles locked on. The American model said air combat began the moment you showed up on our screen, and ended seconds later. That's what the MiG-23 never understood, and that's why it never stood a chance. The world watched on January 4, 1989. 2 U.S. Navy F-14 Tomcats from VF-32, the Swordsman, patrolled the international skies above the Gulf of Sidra. Flying from the deck of the USS John F. Kennedy, they were standard CAP, combat air patrol, guarding carrier operations near Libyan airspace. What they didn't know: 2 Libyan MiG-23s were already airborne, climbing and accelerating fast, vectoring directly toward them. The MiGs had orders to intercept, perhaps even to engage. Libya's air force had long been armed and trained by Soviet doctrine. MiG-23s flown by pilots drilled in frontal assault, rapid acceleration, and radar-guided attacks. The Libyan regime had suffered humiliating defeats before. This time, they wanted a kill. But this wasn't a dogfight. It was a demonstration. The Tomcats picked up the MiGs on their AWG-9 radars at 70 miles, and instantly the crew knew. The MiGs were on a direct collision vector. High speed, nose hot. The F-14s climbed to gain positional advantage. They turned away momentarily, testing the MiGs' intent. But the MiGs adjusted course. They were tracking and closing. That's when the Swordsman locked on. At 40 miles, their radars painted the targets. The MiGs didn't respond. They kept closing. At 15 miles, the F-14s turned hard into the MiGs, an aggressive signal in air combat. Still no deviation. Still no radio contact. Still nose hot. The Americans made a decision. Engaged. Fox 2. A Sidewinder missile launched from the lead Tomcat. It struck one MiG, exploding it instantly. The other pilot tried to dive. Too late. The second F-14 fired another Sidewinder. Another kill. The entire engagement lasted under 60 seconds. Both Libyan MiG-23s destroyed. 0 U.S. casualties. And all of it captured. On radar, cockpit recordings, and broadcast news. It was a masterclass in situational dominance. The Tomcats never broke formation. Never panicked, never even had to use their Phoenix missiles. The aftermath was brutal. Libyan state media denied the losses, but NATO satellites confirmed the wreckage. The Soviet military, watching closely, went silent. There were no protests, no counterclaims, because the truth was undeniable. 2 of their most widely exported fighters, piloted by Soviet-trained aviators, had been obliterated. By aircraft the Kremlin had spent a decade calling overrated. MiG-23 export sales began to stall. Soviet advisors requested urgent reviews of GCI doctrine. Top Gun tapes of the engagement were studied in every Western fighter school. The Gulf of Sidra incident became more than a battle. It became the final proof that all the Soviet assumptions were wrong, that all the American systems were working, and that the F-14 didn't need luck, surprise, or even Phoenix missiles to win. It just needed to see you before you ever knew it was there. By the early 1990s, the MiG-23 was still technically in service across dozens of air forces, but operationally, it was already a ghost. Its combat record was disastrous. In every direct engagement against Western fighters, especially the F-14, it had failed. Not once, not twice, repeatedly, visibly. The loss of credibility was not just tactical, it was ideological. The MiG-23 was the embodiment of Soviet air doctrine. Speed over versatility, automation over training, ground control over pilot autonomy, numbers over integration. But the Tomcat had shattered all of that. It exposed how air dominance in the modern era was no longer about who flew fastest, but about who saw first, thought fastest, and fired farthest. The Soviet Union couldn't admit this failure in public, but behind closed doors, the shift had begun. MiG-23s were quietly replaced by MiG-29s and Su-27s, airframes designed to address the glaring weaknesses exposed by the Tomcat. Better radar, better agility, better pilot empowerment. But it was too late. The Cold War was ending, and the legacy of the MiG-23 was humiliation. Meanwhile, the F-14 Tomcat became legend, not just for its unmatched kill ratios or technological dominance, but because it redefined what a fighter could be. It proved that a naval aircraft, originally built to defend carriers from bombers, could operate as a frontline hunter-killer against the most widely deployed Soviet fighter of its era, and win without loss. Carrier commanders once skeptical of the Tomcat's size and complexity now called it indispensable. NATO partners begged for the AWG-9 Phoenix system, only to be denied for security reasons. And in Iran, even after the fall of the Shah, the F-14 continued flying and killing MiGs with scavenged parts and re-engineered systems. Soviet planners had promised their allies that the MiG-23 could match anything in the sky. That belief collapsed in the smoking wreckage over Libya, Iraq, and Iran. And when the Soviet Union itself fell in 1991, the MiG-23 was already being scrapped, mothballed, or sold for parts. The Tomcat? It kept flying for another 15 years, guarding fleets, striking ground targets, and dominating skies. The war of doctrines had been fought, and the verdict was clear. The West had bet on technology, integration, and the pilot. The Soviets had bet on speed, control, and mass. Only one of them survived the Cold War. The last F-14 Tomcat rolled off the flight deck in 2006, its engines winding down for the final time under the stars of the American flag. Ceremonial, bittersweet, but not forgotten. Because even in retirement, the F-14's shadow stretched far beyond the decks of U.S. carriers. It haunted the skies of history, and it still haunted Soviet doctrine. Today, only one country still flies the Tomcat, Iran, the same Iranian Air Force that, during the 1980s, used U.S.-supplied F-14s to shoot down dozens of MiG-23s in real combat. They've kept the fleet alive through black market parts, local engineering, and sheer willpower, because even they know there's still nothing quite like it. The MiG-23, on the other hand, lives on only in static displays. Its operational days are done, its record tarnished by every real war it fought. In Russia, military historians barely mention it. Pilots avoid comparing it to modern platforms. It's a relic of the past, of a belief system that collapsed under its own arrogance. But the Tomcat? Its silhouette is still painted on the tails of squadrons. Its kills are still studied at aviation academies. Its radar, its missiles, its tactics still influence design today. And the lessons remain. That speed without vision is meaningless. That control without autonomy is weakness. That hardware means nothing without the pilot to wield it. The Cold War was fought in silence, in shadows, in moments like the Gulf of Sidra, where two aircraft passed each other at supersonic speed, and one vanished in flame. The MiG-23 was supposed to be a symbol of Soviet aerial power. Instead, it became a cautionary tale. The F-14 was supposed to be a fleet defender. It became a legend. Even now, when modern stealth fighters rule the skies, the Tomcat's reputation endures. Not because of hype, not because of movies, but because it delivered. Against Soviet steel, it proved untouchable. Against Soviet doctrine, it proved unstoppable. And in every quiet museum where a MiG-23 sits rusting, there's an F-14 somewhere else, shining, remembered, revered, not because it survived, but because it won.